every name lies a secret buried in blood. From inbred kings to cursed families, we follow the veins that built empires, because some bloodlines weren't meant to survive, yet they did. If you found your way here, you already know the truth.
The kerosene lamp trembles first, a tiny flame caught in the draft of an old West Virginia cabin, shivering against thin wooden walls that have heard far too much. Its glow stretches long across the floorboards, until it finds the outline of a woman's shadow rocking in the dark. Her breath is shallow. Her hands shake like they're remembering something her mind has tried to forget. And then, barely above a whisper, her voice cracks the silence. I wasn't born into their darkness. I just learned how to live in it. This is Betty Whittaker, not the legend whispered in town, not the rumor passed across gas station counters, not the ghost name attached to an inbred family the internet turned into a spectacle. No, Betty was the quiet spine of a world collapsing under its own blood. If you found your way here, you already know. The truth rarely screams. It sighs. It trembles. It hides in the corners of rooms where no one dares to look. Welcome to Underbelly Bloodline, where history bleeds, where Appalachia remembers, and where the past never stays buried. Subscribe if you dare, and step deeper into the dark. Because this story begins not with violence, but with a paradox. How can a woman be trapped and still be the one holding everyone else together? Betty wasn't a monster. She wasn't a saint. She was something far harder to name. The bearer of a burden no one acknowledged. The keeper of a family tied together by grief, confusion, dependency, and bloodlines that wound in circles. She rocked in that wooden chair every night after the others had fallen asleep, humming to herself in a voice so soft it barely carried past her lips. Sometimes she prayed, sometimes she cried. Most nights, she simply endured. But on this night, the silence felt wrong. Her rocking stops, the lamp flickers, a cold breath seems to pass through the hallway, and then she hears it. A soft cry drifting from the darkness beyond the doorway. Not a child's cry, not something she recognizes, not entirely human. Betty rises slowly, eyes wide, heart pounding with the certainty that something inside this house has shifted. Something fragile, something fatal. That was the first time she realized the house was breaking, and she was breaking with it, before the heaviness settled over her shoulders like a wet Appalachian blanket, before the night sounds in the holler began whispering her name. Betty Whittaker had softer days. Long before the world knew the Whittakers as a curiosity, she arrived in odd West Virginia as something almost fragile, a thin girl with warm eyes and a laugh that startled even herself, like she wasn't used to hearing joy come out of her own mouth. Mornings were simple then. She would stand behind the cabin, pinning damp laundry to a frayed rope, the cotton sheets ballooning like pale ghosts in the mountain breeze. She hummed when she worked, a little tune from her childhood, a lullaby her grandmother used to murmur on stormy nights. That lullaby would follow her for the rest of her life. She hummed it when she cooked. She hummed it when she was scared. She hummed it when the house felt like it was listening. Inside the kitchen, she kept a chipped blue bowl on the shelf, the only thing she brought with her to Odd. She used it every morning, no matter how cracked it became. And on the nightstand by her bed, she kept a torn photograph. Only half a face remained. The other half she never spoke of. In these early days, Betty believed the cabin might become a home. She brushed mud off the children's shoes when they ran through the yard. She tended to raise worn clothes. She swept the floors, even though the dust returned faster than she could chase it away. Time moved differently here. Slow, heavy, stubborn, as if the holler refused to join the rest of the world. But even in this gentleness, something felt off. A small thing, easy to ignore until it wasn't. There was a bedroom door in the back hallway, a warped old thing, scarred by humidity and years of slamming. Betty would close it every night, push it firmly, listen for the click. But by morning, the door always stood slightly open, just wide enough for a shadow to slip through. She tested it one evening, pushing hard until the frame groaned in protest. It still drifted open an inch, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. Because in this house, some doors don't close because something inside refuses to let them. The first sign that something was truly wrong didn't come from the holler, or the house, or even the family. It came from town. Odd, West Virginia is small enough that secrets don't stay buried. They just grow moss, and long before the internet turned the Whittakers into a roadside curiosity, the locals already had stories. Rumors breathed across porches, traded under church steeples, woven into the Appalachian wind like warnings. Betty heard them long before she understood them. One afternoon, standing outside the old general store with a sack of flour in her hands, she paused when she heard two neighbors whispering behind her. "She ain't one of them," a woman murmured, "but she's trapped just the same." "Bless her," the other replied, "living in that house, with that bloodline." Betty's chest tightened. She didn't turn around. She didn't ask what they meant. She just kept walking, faster than before, the gravel crunching beneath her worn shoes. But the words followed her all the way home. Not one of them, trapped just the same. That evening, while the mountains exhaled their long twilight sigh, the first fracture revealed itself. Betty was passing the narrow hallway when she heard raised voices behind a closed door. Anger trembling through the thin cabin walls, Ray's voice, sharp and frantic. Freddie's, low and stubborn. Lorraine. Crying softly, almost begging. Then she heard a phrase that froze her in place. "Keep the blood pure, pure." The word struck her like a blow. A word too heavy, too old, too full of something she didn't yet have the courage to name. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat stutter. When the voices died down, the door opened just a crack, and Ray stared at her from the shadows. Expression unreadable, eyes too dark for the fading light. Nothing was explained, nothing made sense, and somehow, everything felt worse. That night, Betty lay awake, staring at the bedroom ceiling. The house creaked as it always did, settling, breathing, remembering. But around midnight, a new sound joined the old ones. A sharp crack from inside the wall, like something shifting, or breaking, or trying to get out. Betty held her breath, because for the first time since coming to Odd, the house whispered back. By the time Betty realized the weight of the Whittaker house rested entirely on her shoulders, the air inside had grown thick, not with dust, not entirely, but with expectation, with fear, with the quiet, invisible strain of generations piling atop her spine. She moved through the narrow hallways like a ghost, carrying towels, shirts, bowls, and the invisible debris of fractured hearts. The love-hate bond between her and the brothers had begun to crack. Ray could be gentle one moment, furious the next. Freddie's laughter sometimes hid a cruelty she could almost see behind his eyes. And Betty, torn between affection, duty, and survival, had no escape. She washed a shirt that had been torn in a fight, its blood stubborn against the water. Each scrub felt like she was washing something far older than fabric, a stain that refused to vanish. She paused at the cracked mirror above the sink, staring at her reflection, tracing the lines forming around her eyes. The woman staring back was not the girl who once hummed over laundry in the sun. This was a woman bending under invisible weight, holding together a family that did not pause to thank her, or even notice. The nights were worst. She lay awake, listening to the slow pacing of footsteps in the dark, hearing whispered arguments float through the thin walls. 3 in the morning, 4. Each creak of wood, a metronome of anxiety. She sometimes imagined voices not her own, whispering things she did not want to hear. Sometimes she thought the house was alive, watching, listening, judging. And then the scream came, not a child's, not Ray's, not even Freddie's. Something raw, terrified, and utterly human cut through the night from outside the cabin. Betty bolted upright, heart hammering. The candle flickered violently. The wind seemed to suck the warmth from the room. She reached for the door, and for one long second, the world stopped. Then black. When the light returned, the soft, trembling glow of the kerosene lamp. She noticed something small, almost dismissible, on the wall. A family portrait. It had fallen, face down, onto the floor. And in that quiet moment, she realized the truth of her life here. Some things do not break suddenly. Some families break slowly, like a rope fraying strand by strand. The suitcase sat open on the worn floorboards. Its zipper hung halfway undone, as if hesitant. Inside, Betty had folded the few pieces of clothing she owned, each layer a small protest against the life that had consumed her. She traced her fingers along the worn fabric, feeling the weight of years, the dishes washed, the arguments broken up, the blood scrubbed from old shirts, the lullabies hummed to children who would never thank her. Tonight, she would leave. She rose and took a deep breath, tasting the dust and candle smoke that had become the air she breathed for decades. But the hallway held a presence she had not anticipated. Ray stood there, eyes wide, unblinking, hands trembling. "Betty," he whispered, voice breaking, "who will take care of us?" It wasn't anger, it wasn't a threat, it was dependence. Raw, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. Her chest tightened, as if a hand had reached inside her ribs and squeezed. The fragile world she had built, or perhaps just held together by sheer will, teetered on the edge, one step out that door, and it would all collapse. Ray would fall, Freddie would rage. The children, if they could even be called that, would wander untended. Her fingers brushed the suitcase. Her heart wrestled with herself. And then she understood the cruel truth. She wasn't staying out of fear. She wasn't staying because she had no choice. She was staying because love, impossible and unyielding, had trapped her as surely as the cabin walls ever could. She knelt and closed the suitcase. The zipper clicked like a small verdict. Silence fell, heavy, punishing, suffocating. Outside, the wind whispered through the holler. The trees swayed as if mourning the choice she had just made. The house, already brittle from decades of secrets, seemed to sigh in relief, or perhaps in anticipation. Betty stood in the doorway for one long moment, staring into the darkness she had chosen to remain, to hold the pieces together, to absorb the brokenness of the Whittaker bloodline into her own body and spirit. And in that quiet surrender, a single unshakable thought rose above all else. In saving them, she doomed herself. The house had begun to breathe its own despair. Floorboards groaned under invisible weight. The walls sagged like tired shoulders. Windows rattled with every whisper of the holler wind. And in its core, Betty Whittaker moved like a vessel, absorbing every tremor of illness, every outburst, every sigh of grief, as if the house itself had chosen her as the keeper of its rot. Illness claimed one body, confusion another. Ray raged in the kitchen, while the youngest whispered secrets into the floorboards. Betty carried them all in silence, scrubbed their shirts, cleaned their wounds, and folded sheets over mattresses that had forgotten the meaning of sleep. She had become a sponge, a repository of the family's pain, until the line between their suffering and her own blurred into something indistinguishable. Out in town, stories circulated. Some said she was the only sane one. Others claimed she had enabled the decay, and some whispered quietly that she was as trapped as any of them, shackled by a love she could neither name nor escape. The auditory tapestry of the cabin became a language of dread. A bell from the attic chimed, though no one touched it. A sudden thud rattled the rafters above, followed by the faintest sound of breathing behind a closed door. Each noise sliced through the silence, leaving Betty's heart pounding, her hands shaking. Every shadow, every echo, seemed to whisper warnings she did not want to hear. In the quiet hours between chaos, she moved methodically. She folded a dress she would never wear, smoothing the creases as if ironing out memories she could not erase. Its fabric felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the unspoken stories of her life, sacrifice, love, fear, and despair. Yet even as she performed these small rituals, the house pressed in around her, closing the space between her and inevitability. The walls seemed to lean closer, the floorboards whispered beneath her feet, and the wind that clawed at the windows brought with it the faintest echo of a truth she could not yet face. Betty did not know it yet. She could not. But as she folded that dress, as she scrubbed the blood from another shirt, as she swallowed another night of restless silence, her time was running out. Betty had carried it all. Not just the dishes, the laundry, the bruised egos and broken shoes. Not merely the quiet chores that kept a crumbling house from collapsing entirely. No, she had carried the invisible weight of generations, a burden stitched into the family's bloodline, layered over decades of secrets, shame, and unspoken fears. Sometimes she spoke to herself in whispers, words that floated like dust motes in the lamplight. "They are not monsters," she murmured one night, flipping through a tattered journal she kept hidden beneath the mattress. "They are broken children in grown bodies." And perhaps it was true. She remembered the youngest, small and trembling, recalling how Betty had pressed herself between him and the fury of an argument she could not stop, could only absorb. A shield, a protector, a woman standing silently in the line of inherited chaos. Betty's love was relentless. It was a force so raw it could both nurture and suffocate. She fed them, washed them, soothed them, and yet she feared what they were becoming. The children who had once held hope in their eyes now bore the shadow of a family, cursed not by choice, but by circumstance, by blood, by patterns that refused to be broken. Her reflection in the cracked mirror told another story, one of exhaustion, grief, and an understanding no one else could share. Every line on her face traced a compromise she had made between duty and desire, between love and terror. And yet, even in the quiet moments, there was a gnawing certainty. Without her, the fragile framework of this household would collapse entirely. She realized that her presence was both sanctuary and chain. She was the reason they survived, and perhaps the reason they could never truly be free. She touched the journal, tracing the worn edges of the page with a trembling finger. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters along the walls. She exhaled slowly, a whisper barely audible. "I am not afraid of them. I am afraid of what they'd be without me." Because in loving them so completely, Betty had become both their salvation and their doom. And in that revelation, the tragedy of her existence stood bare, a quiet force holding a storm at bay, knowing that one day even she could no longer hold it. The cabin had begun to take its toll on her, quietly, like the slow erosion of stone under mountain rain. Betty's hands shook more now, not from effort, but from the exhaustion that had seeped into every sinew. Her breath came in shallow, measured pulls, as if even the act of inhaling required negotiation with the walls around her. The house itself had become a reflection of her decline. Floorboards sagged under the weight of time. Windows collected the gray dust of winters past. The hearth's fire sputtered, and the shadows grew longer, colder, darker. She sat on the edge of her bed, the chipped blue bowl from her earliest days an odd, resting between her trembling hands. Its imperfections mirrored her own, a lifetime of small fractures, patched over and endured, but never fully healed. The children had long since drifted into their own rooms, murmuring in sleep, unaware that the quietest, strongest force holding them together was fading. Betty hummed the lullaby again, the one that had accompanied her through laundry, storms, arguments, and whispered confessions. Each note was fragile, trembling in the empty room, echoing off walls that had absorbed decades of noise and neglect. The melody lingered like smoke, curling around the bedposts, around her fingers, around the memories of all she had carried. Outside, the wind whispered through the holler, but no one paid it. Mine Ray slept fitfully, Freddie snored softly, Lorraine turned in her bed. They did not notice the slowing of her heartbeat, the quiet retreat of her life into shadows. Hours passed like a gray tide, and the house exhaled one last, long sigh. Betty's eyes closed, her lips barely moving as the lullaby faded. When morning came, the light fell on an empty bed. The chipped blue bowl lay on the floor, untouched. No one in the Whittaker household understood immediately. They came and went, arguing over trivialities, unaware that the foundation of their world, the invisible spine, the quiet force, had been taken from them. And then the realization hit, a stillness heavier than any storm, a grief that had no sound, only presence. The house did not collapse. Its walls remained upright, the floors did not fall. But the people did. The cabin breathed differently after Betty was gone. Not louder, not quieter, just absent. Rooms once warmed by her presence now seemed to collapse inward, hollowed by a force no one could see, but everyone felt. Silence had entered the walls, not as peace, but as a vacuum. The floors creaked under nothing but emptiness. The windows framed a world that had lost its anchor. Ray moved from room to room, shoulders slumped, muttering fragments of her advice he could no longer follow. Freddie's laughter had become sharper, brittle, a sound that echoed without comfort. Lorraine drifted through the hallways, tracing fingerprints on doors, searching for a hand that would never again steady hers. The children who survived remembered only fragments of care, their small eyes reflecting the absence of the one who had shielded them from both themselves and the darkness in their bloodline. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, their voices carried by the holler wind. "Betty, she held that house together," one said. "Without her, it fell apart," whispered another. Stories drifted across porches and churchyards, stitched together with both admiration and sorrow. And in the corner of the main room, the rocking chair remained motionless. It had cradled her, whispered lullabies into the long nights, kept her vigil as the house sighed and the children slept. Now, it sat like a monument, untouched, a skeletal reminder that the quiet force who had held the Whittakers together was gone. Years later, when the cabin had begun to decay with the rhythm of neglect, a discovery surfaced. A small envelope, tucked beneath the floorboards where Betty had hidden it. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. The family gathered around it, curious and hesitant. They unfolded it slowly, as if even the act of reading could awaken her presence. Inside, a single line was written, deliberate and trembling. "I tried to save them, but some broken things cannot be fixed." The words hung in the air, heavy as the mountain mist, a quiet verdict and a final truth. Inside it was a single line, but it changed everything. The kerosene lamp flickered again. Its thin flame cast long, wavering shadows across the cracked walls of the cabin. A silhouette, fragile, upright, and impossibly alone, seemed to sway gently, suspended in the half-light. The echo of a life once lived lingered, pressing against the room like a memory too heavy to lift. Betty's presence was everywhere and nowhere. The scent of her soap, the faint hum of her lullaby, carried on the Appalachian wind, the chipped blue bowl resting silently on the counter, all spoke of a sacrifice so absolute it had become the fabric of the house itself. She had been the quiet spine, the invisible force keeping generations from unraveling completely. A woman trapped not by the walls, but by the love she had been too strong to release. Every dish washed, every argument softened, every night spent listening to the floorboards creak beneath restless feet had been a tether, holding a family together that could never have survived on its own. In her letter, found long after the cabin had quieted into its own grief, she had written a line that now resonated through the holler like a bell tolling across the mountains. "If I leave, they won't survive. If I stay, neither will I." It was confession, lament, and verdict all at once. A life spent balancing love against destruction, devotion against despair. The lamp flickered one final time, shadows trembling like the heartbeat of a memory refusing to die. Maybe she had never been a Whittaker in blood, in name, or in claim. Maybe her role was far heavier, far darker, far more essential. Maybe she was just the one who held their darkness in her hands. Outside, the Appalachian wind stirred through the holler, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. It whispered through broken shutters, over weathered porches, across the graves and the forgotten toys, sweeping past the mountain as if it knew the truth. And in the hollow silence, one last thought lingered, fragile and impossible. Some curses aren't born, they're inherited by love. The flame guttered, the shadow vanished, and the house exhaled finally into stillness.